Hello and welcome to this short little presentation that I want to give you, chat about Mary Frankenstein's Frankenstein, the Unbound Prometheus. You can read this in its original from lots of different locations on the internet. It's in the public domain now. You can even get good audio versions of it. I wouldn't recommend the movie versions because you'll miss so much. And we want to get into the actual text of Mary Shelley's work. Okay, so you're writing about what's most terrifying in this novel, but I want to also focus in drawing your attention to how things have changed since 40 or so years later, earlier, before this novel was written. So this was written in the late 18 teens. But remember, we're coming out of the Enlightenment here and the French Revolution and that time of boundless optimism. And suddenly Frankenstein gives us a much more sobering, if not terrifying, look at some of the concerns of this period. Not necessarily literally that people would be creating human life, although we've gotten a lot closer to that now than during Mary Shelley's time, around issues such as cloning and human stem cells and things like that. But let's put all that aside for the moment. She does have concerns, though, about science, about other things that are probably going on. But let's explore a little bit about Mary Shelley's life. And to do that, let's also go back to Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft was one of the most influential early feminists. Only later would she become influential, though. In her lifetime, she was fairly obscure. But she was the wife as well of William Godwin, who was a real Enlightenment figure, real kind of progressive for his day and his ideas about marriage and women's emancipation. Very, very out of the ordinary, even at the time of the French Revolution. He's English, though, but even at the time of the English Revolution. And Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley's mother, would have a short marriage with him after a number of failed relationships prior to her relationship with him. Now, there's lots that's very fascinating about Mary Wollstonecraft's biography, her life, right? Her writing Vindication of the Rights of Woman, for example. And in that work of really political philosophy and social commentary, in that work Vindication of the Rights of Women, Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley's mother, is reacting to Edmund Burke's criticism of the French Revolution. His work was called Reflections on the French Revolution, and in that book, he made use of this metaphor, arguing against the French Revolution that a wife should not rebel mindlessly against her husband. It's unnatural, he argued. Well, Mary Shelley read that, and Mary Wollstonecraft read that among other criticisms of the French Revolution, and she was kind of incensed, right? Really angered her. So she started to write an article in response, kind of a battle of the books. And it turned out to be a book where she criticized the kind of education that women were receiving at this time, if they received education at all. Only upper class women received education, and mostly it was education of how to keep a good house, how to manage a household, how to manage the servants, and how to look pretty, and how to play parlor games, and Mary Shelley, and how to look good. Mary Shelley said, this isn't really an education. Yeah, it's learning of a sort, I suppose, but it's learning how to keep women in a glass cage. He actually uses the metaphor of a bird in a cage. The first that we get these kinds of metaphors being used, which will be built upon later. So Mary Shelley also criticizes the institution of marriage in this book, with women's subservience to men in marriages. So she calls for new education for women, equality within marriage for women. She actually attempted suicide several times that we know of, times of depression and after breakups with the long-term relationships that she was in. And after her death, and after she had married this very progressive guy at the end of life, by all intents and purposes, it must have been a pretty happy, though short, tragically short marriage. Mary Wollstonecraft is only about 39, I believe, when she dies in childbirth. And after her death, her husband, William Godwin, wants to venerate her wife by telling her life's story. Unfortunately, he is such an honest guy and sort of before his time that he tells the entire story of her life, including a lot of the tragedies that she had experienced with men in her life, the depression and the suicide. This was too much for society at the time. You can think of it sort of almost like cable news in our times, insofar as people got a hold of these facts about Mary Wollstonecraft's life, and they drug her through the proverbial gutter, right? It was a character assassination. It was as if they were saying, you see, we were right. We told you this woman who advocating for women's rights was a low moral character. Had given herself away to women and had led this very sinful life, they would have said at that time. Well, that's not what her husband had intended when he had published her biography. He wanted to have the story told. It didn't turn out that way. It would take almost a century before her story would be recovered and new life would be blown into it by a new generation of women's activists and feminists in the late 1800s in the suffrage movement. But it's one of the ironies of history that one of the great spokespersons for women early on in modern history also falls prey to death from complications of childbirth. So a very female kind of physical condition, which before the era of modern medicine, birth was, and still is sometimes, dangerous to a woman's health. And Mary Shelley was born and survives, and Mary Wollstonecraft, her mother, the mother of modern feminism in many ways, also dies as well. Just a couple of points now. I gave you some background there on Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, and this fact of her birth being the cause of death for her mother haunts her for the rest of her life, haunts Mary Shelley. She grows up in a very active kind of cultural mixture of people and poets and painters and romantics. And romantics were interested in the environment. It was kind of a pushback against what they saw as the extremes of the Enlightenment, the reason, everything. If it makes sense, then it's good. Well, romantics came along and said, well, what about the beauty of things? And there's something else in nature besides just understanding the natural laws that make it work. What about its beauty? Well, the hardcore philosophers of the Enlightenment would have said, oh, well, beauty is just for romantic, silly people. Well, romantics said, well, that's another part of our existence. It's not just silly. We have to be really attuned to being overwhelmed by beauty. This is what they call the sublime. When you look at a scene or a flower or a field of daffodils, as the poets talked about it, this could overwhelm you, and that was good. Nothing to be ashamed of. And they also not just emphasized the romantic visions of beauty and romantic love as well, but also the negative emotions, the full palette of an experience, emotional experience that we as living human beings experience during our lives. This includes fright and terror as well. Look at how the scenes in the book Frankenstein, Unbound Prometheus are described. You'll see a lot of lush descriptions of the environment. Look at the way it starts out. They're way up at the Arctic, in the Arctic. These guys are chasing after each other, kind of the aftermath of this whole life of Frankenstein and the creature that he has created. I ask you in this discussion that we're having here, what's the most terrifying thing about Frankenstein? Is it the fact that he creates, that Dr. Frankenstein creates a monster that he is then unable to control? That's one, perhaps, area of freedom, of not freedom, a lack of freedom for the monster and the body that he's been created within and brought into this world without a choice. That's part of it. What about other things as well, like the fact that the monster is never named? He's just a creature. He's the first great, famous, and probably most famous orphan of the 19th century. This century where orphans and people without mothers and fathers will be romanticized, and the children will be romanticized. And the creature here is kind of like a child, isn't he? So is it the lack of love as well, that the love story that's embedded in the novel? Just another piece of context as well, the historical context that was going on at this time. This was a summer without a summer, when there was this giant volcanic eruption in Indonesia, on the island of Sumbawa. The volcano was called Tambora. This was then part of the Dutch East Indies colony. It was a week-long eruption, April 5th, 1815, though its impact will be felt for years. And Mary Shelley is off traveling Europe in a kind of dream travel across southern Europe. She goes to Geneva, Italy, which has been hit hard by the weather aftermath of the volcano, the weather. Here's a quote from her diary. All earth was but one thought, and that thought was death. Immediate and inglorious death. The pang of famine fed upon all entrails. Men died, and their bones were tombless as their flesh. That's what she saw in Geneva, Italy at the time. It had been a wet, ungenial summer. Another way that she describes it, it was incessant rain. And as she traveled through Italy, they found themselves often confined inside, where one evening they start challenging themselves to telling ghost stories. And that's where Mary Shelley has the inspiration for Frankenstein. Okay, so that should serve as a brief introduction to Frankenstein, the Unbound Prometheus. I hope you find it useful. I will talk to you all virtually online.
Video recording button. 15 minutes of video. Stop taking